Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform, and within operation of our Brain Hub platform we start the discussion about the consequences of destruction of Kakhovka Dam. What we are going to discuss is the consequences of the destruction, the decisions of the government about the development of the region, and the way the expert community sees the development of the region. And we will pay more attention to the environmental component of the problem. My guests today are Yakiv Didukh, Academician of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, head of the Department of Geobotany and Ecology, named after Kholodny. Then Dmytro Skrylnikov, head of the Bureau of Environmental Investigation NGO, the Kakhovka Platform Initiation, Sergei Dubnyak, head of the Department of Ecological Hydrology and Technical Hydrobiology of Institute of Hydrobiology of National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and Oleg Listopat, an expert at the National Interest Protection Network of Ants. It's my pleasure to see all of you here, and I want to comment that the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine coordinated the reconstruction of Kakhovka Dam after the destruction. The experimental project contemplates a lot of articles. The government is about to allocate about $1.2 billion, and the funds are expected to be received from international financial institutions. So that was a statement that was made within a short period after the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Were there any consultations, or is the consolidated position of the scientists and experts? Has the government taken this decision in coordination with the professional community, and what's your opinion about that? So let's start with Mr. Didukh, please. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Well, about a month ago, we've made it to that area. There were botanists taking part in that journey, but before I start talking about the problems, I would like to answer your question whether there were consultations with the specialists. You know, there is a number of groups or experts who are dealing with this issue. First of all, there is an expert team created with the committee. Within the system of Academy of Sciences, there is another expert team working, and there are non-government organizations which involve many scientists who work on that matter too. So there is no joint opinion or joint discussion for the time being. Every expert community works on their levels, and maybe the Cabinet of Ministers, while taking the decision, probably those experts were participating who were involved in the discussion. So I was not one of those, and I cannot comment on that. Well, as we came there, we've seen a horrific picture, you know, a duct, like a desert with the spots of Dnipro. So such a big scale ruination of the Kakhovka Dam is really an environmental catastrophe, and even if we don't evaluate the human victims and material losses, the hydrotechnical destruction of Kakhovka Dam as a result of battle operations is the biggest environmental catastrophe that we still need to assess to compensate the losses. Another thing is the mining of the territory. As you go there, hundreds of kilometers on the right curb of the road, there are those placards, mines, 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 and it will stay for years and years, plus the harvest that was lost. That's yet the second environmental catastrophe. And the third thing is the fires. Apart from the pits, from the explosion of projectiles, and we define it as ecocide. There are different definitions of ecocide. In the Criminal Code of Ukraine, the Article 141. But in my opinion, ecocide is the intentional human activity aimed at destruction or damage of the ecosystems of its components, such as groundwater sources, flora, fauna, and contamination of air that are not capable of self-sustainment, that results in catastrophic environmental processes, the loss of biodiversity, that it negatively affects the environment and the welfare of the society. So if you ponder over every single word or the phrases altogether, the destruction of Kakhovka Dam falls exactly under this definition of ecocide. And also we have to understand that what's going on there is overlapped by the climate change, so we should talk about it not only as the ecologists, but during the following meeting of the PCC or on the climate change. You know, I was dealing with climate change, so we have to ruminate how to include those battle operations, those warfare actions in that ecocide and submit for compensation of losses. So again, as we went there, we've seen that horrific picture, a large-scale destruction, and we've put together the forecast. What can happen there? We've assessed the succession, what can happen there. It can transform into forests, orchards, deserts, or spotted deserts. So we started discussing what would happen. For example, what was the Great Cossack Book? And we found its description in the words of Mikhailo Akimov. He describes the total area of 80,000 hectares made of swamps, lakes, rivers. There are forests and orchards, willows growing there, again swamps, bogs, and there were also cane spots which contained a lot of birds and fish. So those were very specific conditions which support the life of the swamp birds. They were immense. Within the major part of the year, they were attracting birds. And since Dnipro is one of the main transit ways of the migrating birds, we understand that the Great Book was a location where a lot of birds, animals, and fish were living. There was intense hunting going on in those areas, so those areas were a productive force of the local and territorial meaning. However, it was not properly studied back then, and now their riches were not used in a rational manner. And back in the 20s of the century 20, he was saying that a natural reserve should be created there. So this Veliki Luk is not a lawn that we imagine when we say a lawn. It's or a meadow that was an area semi-drowned with water. So what's going on now after this catastrophe? I think that we should not use emotions but facts. We should calculate everything. We should calculate all the risks, all the possible options, and so on and so forth. So Cabinet of Ministers has proposed one of the options is to rebuild the Kakhovka Dam. I think that there may be 4 scenarios: full drowning, partial drowning, up to certain meters that would allow preservation of water to the extent of drying the south to cover the needs of the nuclear power plant. Then not to drown it completely. And fourth option is deepening of the riverbed. So if the total capacity of the hydraulic power plant was 4,600 megawatts, I've calculated what is the amount of electric power generated by it. It was amounting to 1% or 8% of total output from the hydraulic power plants. Meanwhile, 23% of the area was drowned. So I don't know. Is it purposeful to drown it back? I was criticized for for manipulating with the figures of electric power cost. So I've recalculated it and I've come to 8 to 9% if we evaluate the ecosystem services, of the natural ecosystems that can exist there and what they produce and the electric power. So electric power is around 7% of those costs. So there is a number of issues, there is a number of ways to calculate. Mr. Yakov, let's so I'll just tell you about the position. So what we've came up with after several days of our work there, after our studies there. Mr. Yakov, thank you very much. I would like to ask about the forecast. How can the ecosystem develop? What the riverbed will transform to? Mr. Sergey, maybe you can comment it from the expert point of view. How do you see the options for the development of this ecosystem, even talking about the reconstruction of Kakhovka Dam? It's a matter of not the next half a year, over a year. Well, really, the creation of the new ecosystem in that surface that has emerged after the draining of water from Kaniv water reservoir, it will be going on gradually. And remembering the way this Veliki Luk was looking, this great meadow was looking back then, we know that it's not as it used to be. The landscape has changed, it has become more flat. Those elevations are now clogged with the riverbed sediment, and the substrate is quite different. We have that sludge that can become a good fertilizer for development of the vegetation, but again, some time is necessary to transform it into a normal structured soil so it accumulates the organic components to have the vegetation grow on top of it. That's on one hand, and on the other hand, we understand that the reconstruction of the water reservoir is a lengthy process too. We don't know where we can even start it. The construction itself requires at least 5 years, as the expert technicians were saying, and then refilling of the reservoir will depend on the water coming from Dnipro, and we see that lately we have years with not so much water, so it can take 2, 3, maybe even more years depending on the intensity of the water flow. So there will be some development one way or another, but currently we can only observe, unfortunately. What could be done? First thing, in the Academy of Sciences, there was an expert team created to include a number of institutes, including our institute, that was working on evaluation of consequences and the catastrophic losses that resulted from this catastrophe. And now we're working on the proposals, what to do next, given this resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers. I think it was a little bit too hasty, because currently there is no consolidated position of the scientists, of the project engineers, the community regarding, first of all, whether it should be reconstructed, and if so, how to do it. That's yet another important question. So yes, what could be done if there was excess there? We could manage the process of ecosystem renewal, because it will get covered with the weeds, including invasive species, without intrusion or intervention, because those weeds, they are more fit in the conditions that are not so good for other types of vegetation. But to have normal vegetation grow there, the types of flora should be sown there. Now we can't even get normal information about the conditions there. You know, those expeditions, they were going on in the bays that are remote from the main equator of the reservoir, because for what I know, currently there is no access to the water reservoir to its main part. We only have some fragments of information from different sources where water can be approached. For example, our institute has received information from the hydrologist. We've taken samples of water, but the volunteer who was doing it was wounded, so it's quite a dangerous task now, let alone organizing some normal studies that would produce some verifiable results. So this is how the situation unfolds now. But talking about the prospects, in my opinion, we need to renew the water reservoir, because the water supply for the population that lives in that region, plus the development of the agriculture as it existed in this region, is practically impossible without those water resources that were accumulated in the Kakhovka water reservoirs. So we should decide how to develop this region otherwise without the water reservoir. And it's not only about agriculture, but also about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There will be water in the cooling poles for some time, but the level of groundwater has fallen too, and the water will be obviously filtered. But again, it invokes a number of problems with the water supply all over the region. You know, all that region was developing within 70 years with the water reservoir. If it would have been happening in a different way, probably the agricultural sectors would have been formed in a different way. But we have what we have, and we cannot absolutely refuse the use of the Kakhovka reservoir water. But still, there is a question whether everything was alright with the Kakhovka water reservoir when it was operating. Well, I can tell you that it was not quite alright, just like with all water reservoirs, as we can observe now. is the so-called overdevelopment of phytoplankton that results in so-called blossoming of the water reservoirs, that results in not so attractive view of the Kakhovka water reservoir. So what was wrong about it, in my opinion? Kakhovka water reservoir is or was the biggest water reservoir in Ukraine, water from which was used quite inefficiently, and it was related to the regime of its operation. The normative useful amount of water from Kakhovka dam was about 7 cubic kilometers out of 18 total in the water reservoir. But in the summer, when the water is mostly needed, when the irrigation is going on, the water could not be practically used because relatively high level of water was preserved, like 15.5, 16 meters, because the water was supplied to the northern Crimean channel from Kakhovka water reservoir. So to create this slope, we had to preserve the high level of water. So in the beginning of the 90s, on the state level, different projects of reconstruction were being reviewed. Different options were considered as to the change of its operation modes to make sure that that huge amount of water accumulated there could be used properly, because it was a huge water reservoir with a very small utility ratio. The Institute of Hydrobiology was assessing it, and they were evaluating it quite positively. For example, the change of operation would not result in destruction of ecosystem, but it would intensify the flow of water and reduce that blossoming effect, plus increase the irrigation effects. So the way it's used, it's mostly the water from Kremenchuk water reservoir is used and then supplied from Kakhovka, there was supplied from Kakhovka reservoir to irrigation channels. So do I understand you correctly? So if the Kakhovka water reservoir doesn't operate, the problem arises with the replenishment of northern Crimean channel. So there is nothing to fill the Crimean channel with if the Kakhovka reservoir doesn't exist. You know, its capacity was 390 cubic meters per second, and the flow of Dnipro can slow down to 300 cubic meters per second. So we should channel all of Dnipro over there, even without accumulating water. Technically, just to supply water to the channel, we should have a reservoir from which this water can be supplied, not from the riverbed where those, as I mentioned, 300 cubic meters flow per second. So if we're talking about liberation in Crimea in certain prospect, if the Ukrainian government will have to solve the problem with the water supply, they will start facing this problem as well. Yes, in my opinion, we should refuse this, not idea, but this option of the self-sustained water flow. It will be more expensive to pump it with the pumps, but the water reservoir can be constructed in a different way. So we have to reevaluate the concept. Yeah, it should be a modern concept based on the existing conditions. Yes, those shortcomings that existed in the water reservoir, and plus if we unite all the approaches by those environmental experts, and by the way also archaeology experts, you know, there are a lot of archaeological monuments in that area, so we can join those approaches and think properly and design the water reservoir in a way it fulfills its functions, we can reduce reduce the flow. We can manage it in the upper stream, you know, of this, as it was done in the Kani water reservoir. All those lands were preserved because a number of protective dams were built, and such systems were created, which are currently the recreation spots and are also used by the fauna. Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Dmytro, you represent the Bureau of Environmental Investigations, so what is going on with the investigation of this environmental crime? Is there a methodology how the information is being collected? How do you contact the government bodies? Are there any results of such investigations, and can they serve us as evidence in the courts when we prepare to different different suits to be reviewed by international courts to compensate the losses inflicted by Russia? Thank you very much. Apart from my studies, I would also like to say that I am also a representative of Kakhovka platform NGO, which created to evaluate different options, different scenarios of development. But in terms of verification, it's a complicated process. It will take years, and to prove the fact of a crime, we had to document the previous conditions, and we have to document the current conditions in compliance with the internationally accepted methods. And obviously that process, the reparation of the environmental losses, will take years. And in fact, if we come back to your question, to the topic of the previous panelists, that's a different discussion. It's not about the evaluation of losses. Here we have to talk about the compensation for losses resulted from war aggression all over Ukraine, and this work is still underway. But still, as we get back to your first question that you've asked all of the panelists about the resolution of the government, I would like to expand here. When we talk about this terroristic act on the Kakhovka Dam, we have to talk about the fate of all of the region, the fate of the region, of the communities that reside there. And we are being tried to have it boil down to the discussion of certain project, thus depriving us of any other scenarios. And now we start discussing the details of that specific project. But in fact, in this context, the fate of the region is important. And obviously, when during Soviet era the Kakhovka hydraulic power plant was built, no one was concerned about the fate of the surrounding areas when they were destroyed during the act of terrorism. The fate of those people who lived there was of no interest to anybody. So we would like to avoid the situation when those decisions have influence on the fate of the people in that territory in the long-term perspective. Why I'm saying so? Because in fact we have a big problem, the lack of strategic planning. We're not talking about the 1 or 2 year solution. We're talking about the solution that will affect the fate of the region for decades. So talking about reconstruction of Kakhovka Dam only is not correct. So before we pick the proper option, we take the right decision whether to rebuild it or not, I would urge everybody to analyze all possible scenarios for development of the region. Given the existence of the reservoir and the dam, we've seen a number of options here: to rebuild the dam and the reservoir, rebuild them without reservoir, or the other way around, or not rebuild anything, then to contemplate another options for cooling of the NPP reactors. So what's missing, first of all, is the collection of proper basic fundamental information and the strategic planning. For example, the agrarians may have one opinion, the nuclear engineers may have another opinion, and the water construction engineers yet another opinion, but we have to compare all the parameters, and we have to say that if we do this, there will be advantages here and losses here, and in case of other option, that will be the other way around. So there will be more of a hunting for funds rather than proper planning for reconstruction of the region. So this is exactly what Kakhovka Platform Coalition was created for. The idea of creation came up way before the resolution of the government, and we had to develop a number of scenarios. The coalition includes more than 40 representatives of the local governments, scientists, non-government organizations. It includes people with different opinions who do not protect any specific alternative. They have different visions of the development of the region. But our task was to build a correct model, because any planning in the world, in the civilized world, specifically if you want to be guided by the principle of build back better, as we declared, it should be based on the analysis of alternatives. First we were said that there are no alternatives, then there will be no high quality analysis of the alternatives, and in these conditions it's not feasible to consider any resolutions of the government, of the cabinet of ministers. So it's a little bit premature. This is why we say it's a little bit premature, because it was taken without consideration of any verifiable scenarios and without adherence to the standards of international practices. So that's the problem with this resolution. Not because it's right or wrong, it just doesn't consider all the available alternatives, and if there are funds allocated, it will mean that something was decided without any scientific reasoning. Okay, Mr. Dmytro, but when do we expect the development of these scenarios that you would be able to present? Well, first of all, we will try it within the framework of our platform. It's a non-linear situation. There is a number of factors to be analyzed. First, it's water supply. Then it's the impact on the energy sector, nuclear sector, agriculture. And yet another factor is we don't know what happens in 10 years. If the dam will be reconstructed within 10 years, so what should we do? You know, it's important to develop such options, such plans. This is something that we do and government does not. And I think it should be done at the government level, you know, and all the funds should be forwarded at planning of the scenarios, because really in Ukraine we have planning tools, for example, for river basin. For what I know, the river basin of Dnipro is planned, and not only, and at least within this instrument, the government should plan the development of the region. Obviously, us as the civil coalition, we will take all necessary efforts to demonstrate different options, but it should be a government's task, because there should be first strategic tasks and then any resolutions taken. And the resolution that was taken by the government, in fact, it already documents some parameters. that deprive us of other alternatives, and it's in contradiction with the international legislation. And the last thing I want to say, something that I was specifically concerned even in the name of this resolution. The project is somehow called experimental. I still cannot solve this riddle. What is the experiment? What is the essence of this experiment? It's not a laboratory experiment. It's the experiment on the fate of the region. Maybe it was an attempt to make a way around the legislation, as the last article says that this experimental project is implemented without evaluation of the environmental effect and, for example, road construction standards. So again, those are no fundamental conditions for the experiment. It's just an attempt to make a way around the existing legislation, or otherwise the word experimental is used because of lack of confidence of the government in their resolution, so that in any case they can say, okay, that was an experiment that didn't work, but it may have very significant consequences in the long-term perspective. So if we plan any experiment, it should be based on the analysis of scenarios and proper decision making. But again, we will take all necessary effort to communicate to the government that it should be based on the studies of different experts, different sectors. This is what was said by previous panelists. We cannot resort to hasty decisions that may be of catastrophic consequences for the region in the long run. Thank you. Mr. Oleg, it's your turn now. The name of your organization contains the wording the protection of national interests, and from the point of view of national interest, how do you see the development of the situation? So first, I'll respond to whether the government was consulting. So again, Institute of Hydrobiology studies the Kakhovka Dam from the moment of its creation, and they were not involved in negotiations. You've heard the words of Mr. Yakiv Didukh. He was not involved in negotiation. You've heard the opinion of the representative of civil organizations. He was not involved in discussions as well. So I think it was just the desire of the energy technicians who got the contract for $1 billion, in fact, to fulfill some works nobody knows about, because no one has seen any documents, any plans, and so on and so forth. 10 years is the real term that they say, because 5 years is not the real term, you know, before the project is implemented. Well, I don't think that the land will be liberated, but 10 years, no one is going to wait for 10 years without the water. Well, nobody will wait for 10 years to solve the problem with the cooling of the Zaporizhia NPP. So the water supply to the Crimean Channel. What is the Crimean Channel? Its riverbed is all in holes. You know, I was there in 2003, and the experts were telling me that it's a colander. The water was just running into the ground, and the water spending was in vain in large amounts. Plus, there is an intense evaporation in that region. Should we supply water to Crimea in this way? That's a big question. Again, the irrigation systems in the eastern bank are not used for more than 1 year due to occupation. No one knows of their condition. The mainway channels, what is their condition? They are in terrible condition. Again, who can repair it? Who will repair it? At what cost? There are no answers to these questions. At the same time, well, switching to optimistic news, look, we have online experts, we have experts coming here in person. We have specialists who can create mathematical models, wonderful mathematical models. We had a meeting with Natalia Kosula. She's one of the leading professionals in the area of mathematical modeling. We have a huge institute, the Institute of Mathematical Problems of Machines and Systems. They are involved in a number of international projects. For example, they were making calculations in case of destruction or damage of Kiev Dam. What would be the scenarios of drowning? And they count everybody down that it would be bad, but it should not create panic. So Institute of Hydrobiology, they had joint calculations what is going on in case of resumption of operations of transport in the Kiev reservoir. Why doesn't government involve those specialists? The evaluation of impact on the environment, those are just a small teams of people to be created for quite a modest money, and they undertake quite an extensive responsibility, which is not normal. It's good that such laws exist about the impact on the environment, but that's not enough. Such serious project as we're discussing now, the fate of the whole region, the government should formulate the terms of reference. They should start a bid, they should start funding, and the teams of scientists who have the National Fund of Research of Ukraine, who have relevant experience, who have access to grant funding. And let's see what will be the scenarios proposed by the scientists. The hydrologists, they show on the graphs that during the years when the water level was low, there is such a man, Mikhailo Kholodny, who used to be a deputy minister of environment. We invited the representatives of that ministry here, but they haven't come. So he was not afraid. So he was saying, so behind those scenarios, the water will be not enough. Just to make sure that the water exists downstream of Zaporizhia HPP. So he was showing how much water goes to the water supply, how much goes to the irrigation purposes. So if the level of water during this year is not high enough, this will be the amount of water that we will be missing. And let's talk about this problem, where to get this amount of water. So Mr. Syrota, who is the head of Ukrhydroenergo, he's a cool specialist, but he honestly speculates on this problem. Back in my day, I've written three articles about the Kakhovka Dam 2. There was such a project, and I described the positive and negative aspects there. And I described that there was no fish over there, so only one of those articles was reprinted in the website of the Hydroenergo. Now Mr. Syrota, here's to the critics. He said that we will build a new dam with relevant facilities for the fish. But it's not a fact that it can be technically done generally. It's not done in this way, you know. That's why let us, dear representatives of the government, remember that you have specialists, you have scientific institutions, they still exist. Please find the funds to finance the work of those specialists, and you will get marvelous scenarios for optimal solution to those problems. Well, it's a wonderful, not a period but a comma. I hope the government would hear us. I would like to give opportunity to our journalists to ask their questions. Please introduce yourself and start asking. Vladislav Obuch, Ukrinform, referencing the words of Mr. Oleg about the fate of the northern Crimean channels. What are the alternatives of the water supply to the peninsula after it's liberated? the desalination could hardly become a normal alternative because it's a very costly technology, plus this water should be transported to the steppe regions of Crimea, which will add more to its costs. Well, first let's calculate what is the amount of water that we need there, what is the amount of population there for utility needs and for recreation season. For example, given the current population of Crimea, significant part should be moved back to Russia. They have nothing to do with Crimea, they should be brought back home. As to the needs of the industry, there are two significant large industrial facilities. Crimean Titan, that is a property of Mr. Firtash, is a very harmful enterprise. You remember there was a catastrophe when the residual reservoirs were dry and the sulfur hydrogen started coming to the agricultural lands and it started evaporating, everything started turning yellow. So should we retain it there? Now the Ministry of Environment keeps saying that we try to engage the best available technologies. In fact, there is a bank of such technologies and they can be easily taken and used after, well, we can invest our money and create a technical revolution, so to say. But again, let's calculate to what extent this industrial facility is necessary. There are people who can calculate. And again, as to the irrigation of the steppe parts of Crimea, I don't know if irrigation is necessary there. The soils are very difficult there. The situation with the soil water is difficult there too. And even if we decide that this channel should continue operating, we will have to reconstruct it. First, the new channel bottom should be built and then it should be covered. So if we multiply its width by its length, again, there is a huge evaporation there, given the total area of it. Thank you. More questions? Or if I may add a couple of words, please. To what Mr. Oleg has just said, I would like to add something based on my... I think that one way or another the water should be supplied to Crimea, because Crimea is not only the southern shore, not only Crimean Titan, but also it's a military base of Russian Federation, and it will be ours. I think that we will need to have quite a powerful military base there, so we have to think about the lands in the north of Crimea, because before the Crimean Channel was created and before the water started being supplied to Crimea, it was all burnt out steppe, and back then there were new settlements there, and even the population in the northern Crimea is tied to irrigation, so we will have to review it from the point of view of saving water resources. The same should be done with Kakhovka or water reservoir. All the parameters should be reconsidered. We should build the channel in a way with the minimal filtration. It can be technically done. So we have to plan all of it. Again, if we plan to renew the water reservoir in some way, we have to think about the operation of those systems at the same time that will withdraw the water from the water reservoir, because rebuilding a water reservoir without calculation of this outflow will result in creation of potential that would not be used for in a long haul. So it should be considered in complex, not like water reservoir by itself and then the hydraulic power plant by itself. So there was a proposal of reconstruction of water reservoir without reconstruction of hydraulic power plant. So I think it makes no sense. Definitely, if the water flows, it should be flowing through the turbines of HPP. And a couple of more words, if I may, regarding the energy sector. If we recreate the reservoir again, it makes no sense reconstructing it without the hydraulic power plant, but talking about the operation of Kakhovka HPP as it was, its capacity was low from the point of view of the Dnipro cascade. It was the hydraulic power plant with the lowest capacity, and the water was just sometimes drained during winter. So again, there was this project of Kakhovka 2. We were evaluating the environmental impact. So again, it's a huge question. If the HPPs, if the dams exist, it's not so bad. You know, if they drain water all the way from Kakhovka to Dniprovka Buk Liman, they were ensuring the fluctuations in the delta of Dnipro. And without the fluctuations, the areas would be bogged. The vegetation would start appearing there, so it's not so bad. I mean, with this HPP, we have reconsidered both positive and negative aspects. Thank you. Alexander Kutsak, Ukrainian Radio. One of the options, as I've read on the internet by the energy technicians, they said that it's enough to cover 1% of the area of the lost water reservoir with the solar panels. How real is it, and how can it save the situation? To what extent as the alternative to the HPP? Well, you know, the energy technicians, they reject those arguments. They say that HPP was necessary not for generation, but more to cover the peak overloads. And under those premises, they want to build Dnipro hydro accumulation power plant and Kakhovka hydro accumulation power plant. So, but again, this water should be pumped back and forth, so it's a double price. So let's ask, for example, how Australia managed to engage Mr. Musk and solve this problem without hydraulic power plants and hydro accumulating power plants. You know, Natalia Kosuk, that I was meaning. The prospects she's drawn are horrific. I'm afraid of them now. If I may also add a couple of words, before there are no specific models and scenarios, imposition of some individual solutions is the manipulation one way or another. Before we build those complex models which consider all the factors, I agree with Mr. Oleg that there are numbers of technical solutions. They in Australia, they finance waterways to different regions, and we don't know what will happen with us. So before we develop any such scenarios, any decision gives a lot of space for manipulation. But all those individual solutions should be overlapping the complex models. You know, combination of different sources of energy can provide for the same amount of generation of electric power. But again, we don't have this modeling now. We have nothing other than desire to rebuild what was existing before. You know, now they say that Ukrhydroenergo, they say that the hydraulic power plant, which is about to be rebuilt, will generate twice as much as electric power. So again, we should review everything in the complex context. Anything other than that can be used by both opponents and proponents of the reconstruction as a manipulation. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Good afternoon. Facts editorial. I have a question to Mr. Sergey. If during some period the water from Kremenchuk water reservoir was used for irrigation, is it possible to organize at least temporary withdrawal of water from Kremenchuk water reservoir as it exists now for irrigation? I probably was not quite precise. So the water from Kremenchuk water reservoir was going to Kakhovka water reservoir, and then it was channeled for irrigation, but it's not the water from the Kremenchuk water reservoir. So supplying the water from Kremenchuk water reservoir to irrigation system, we have to build some huge waterways, hundreds of kilometers long. I did not calculate it, but again, we're talking about very serious waterways. We're talking about the amounts of 100 cubic meters of water per second. So do we need to build another Crimean channel going through Kremenchuk water reservoir? But again, withdrawing water from reservoir is even technically difficult if the water is accumulated in Kremenchuk water reservoir. What I'm saying is that Kakhovka water reservoir may become such an accumulating facility for water, but we should just devise another option for supply of the water to irrigation system. Thank you very much. We are right on time. I really appreciate it. It was quite interesting. I hope our spectators were interested too. Again, I'm reminding you we're working in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform, and our today's discussion was assisted by Yakiv Didukh, Academician of the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, Dmytro Skrylnikov, Head of the Bureau of Environmental Investigation NGO, Sergei Dubnyak, Head of the Department of Ecological Hydrology and Technical Hydrobiology, and Oleg Listopat, an expert at the National Interest Advocacy Network ETS. So I hope the government will hear the experts, scientists, and create the complex approach which will take into account all the available options. Thank you very much.